the definition as well. I think we're making some generalizations here about what the ECL, Environmental Conservation Law, actually is asking you to do. When I look at the ECL, I don't know that it expressly prohibits the promulgation of regulations of land production. I don't think that it says that. The other thing is, which begs the question which somebody already asked. If it's not going to be done through this rulemaking process, how are we going to be regulating the production of LNG? The other thing, when I look at the environmental conservation law, it talks about two things: liquefied natural gas and liquefied petroleum gas facilities. Both those things are in the ECL. Now, my understanding is that liquefied petroleum gas is something that's being proposed right now in certain places. And have you promulgated rules for that?
It's an odd part of the LNG law that it discusses LPG and then it exempts it. I don't know why they set it up that way, but that's the way it does it.
Well, I'm going to ask you to take a close.
Sure, I can sit down with you and show you.
Hi, I want to come back to the issue of why now with these regulations. As a little background, we know that this past legislative session, the oil and gas industry was heavily invested in Albany in lobbying for a bill around LNG, particularly transportation. The bill in question was limit the size to 40,000. That bill did not go through. It is striking to me that after that bill, which was at the very tail end of the legislative session, failed, that just months later, the DEC comes out with these regulations. So I have a couple questions just to get to the background here. First, which division of DEC or which divisions were most invested in drafting these most current regulations?
What we did back in 2002 or 3 is we formed a working group among several state agencies. It was led by DEC because we're charged with doing it, but it also includes DOT, Department of State and the Office of Fire Prevention and Control, the Public Service Commission, who else? NYSDEC,
and then there was various divisions within the DEC from our division as tasked with it, as well as the Division of Permits and
Air was involved.
Division of Air slightly. There was one other division. I didn't bring that list with me, but we had.
Where was no resources involved?
No, they were not involved.
And so, what was the time then? When were these really put together that now they've come out here for us in October? Just understand, it seems very striking that it failed in the legislature, and a couple months later, the industry has made this push for it, they're invested in it, they're politically involved, and then here they are magically right now.
Yep, good question. So the history, we started working in earnest on these regulations 2003 with this interagency, interdivisional work group. We actually had a first draft ready to go in 2008 when the governor's office that I talked about came back to us and said, we want you to do another study. So we set those regulations aside. We went back, we did that additional study. We took a look at the study, we took a look at the law again, and went through the process in 2011 to make some further revisions and clarifications within the regulations themselves. And we were basically done. The 2011, 2012, the regulations were substantially complete and have been in routing and review and approval process since then. With the advent of the bills that were in front of the legislature, executive upstairs basically held off saying, let's put these regulations out there until we know whether these bills pass or not, because they would have an instrumental impact in what would be in the regulation. So the regulations themselves have been routing since last fall, early winter type time frame. So they've been substantially done waiting for the information on whether those bills were going to pass or not.
And so coming back to the February process when we brought in the environmental and industry groups, presumably, after that period, has the industry been very involved in communication about the specifics in these regulations? And I ask this in the context, in looking through the regulations, they're very vague in many places. Again, there are no size limitations, there are no siting limitations, there are restrictions to speak of. And most of the language is sort of like, okay, you go ahead and all of the above. And there's very little language about exactly what the regulations and the laws are, which seems extraordinarily favorable to the oil and gas industry. So my question is, what was their involvement in there, and how much influence may they have exerted through executive or legislative or the agency offices in relationship there?
Fair question. So the answer to that is very little. And we're actually talking about in the next couple of slides direct answer to some of those questions about, well, what is actually being required here. The regulation is short, but it doesn't mean that there is an open-ended, just go out and do anything you want. There's a lot of stuff in there. From the February meeting, we had environmentalists that were there, as well as some of the industry folks. They did take a look at some of the stuff. They raised some of the concerns of, you've got some very vague language here. Can we get clarification? Some of the things we tried to clarify, some of them we said, we got them where we want them to be. It gives us the ability to look at site-specific conditions and try to form permits that are be appropriate for that particular site. Some of the things did not get changed. But we had the opportunity for getting feedback from the environmental side, NYPIRG, as well as some of the industry folks that had indicated some interest in looking at LNG. And they raised questions and issues that we tried to figure out how we could address.
My name is Roxanne John from Sheldrake, New York. I have more questions, but in light of what you were just talking about, I have a basic question to ask you, and that is, are the people who are in front of us today the actual people who have worked on these regulations and come up with these ideas? Or are you the spokesman for those who did? Are you the decision makers?
I was the one that actually was the chair of the interagency interdivisional work group, and I was some of my staff, but myself personally, were directly involved in writing and drafting the regulation.
Oh, that's very interesting, because the way you speak, you make it sound as if your hands are quite tied. So I'm wondering by who your hands are tied exactly. Because my question has to do with the narrowness of the regulations that you are allowed to enforce to protect the environment of New York State. It seems that there's little scope for the DEC to inhibit the mass industrialization of New York State. Regulations appear to be piecemeal, industry-driven, and examined, and not at all holistic, examining any proposed project within the context of larger issues related to environmental responsibility, global warming, or the very real impacts on human health, safety, or even survival. In this frustrating exchange, we, the public, express our frustration at the very process whereby life and death decisions are being imposed by your agency. Our agency? I thought the DEC was our agency. But okay, it's your agency. On us. On our lives, on all of us, decisions that will also impact your own lives as well. So for me, the division between us, the public, and you, the agents, sent here by the DEC, and thank you very much that they sent the real decision makers to us, because I think you are the ones that should feel the pressure from us, the public. But I feel that this division is false and arbitrary. My question regards the process itself and the DEC. It is obvious that the DEC now sees its primary role is to enable industrial development. So is there any movement or mechanism for dissent within the agency to begin to foment change from within or from outside? If so, where can we, the public, put pressure on you or us, our own agency, to transform it, or rather restore it to its original and stated purpose, to conserve and protect our environment? Put another way, as mere cogs in the wheel, because you do act as if you're cogs in the wheel. You talk about being decision makers, and yet every time we put pressure on you, all you can say is, well, the regs only allow us to do that. Well, who wrote the regulations, and under whose pressure were the rules written in this way? Do you or your colleagues, as employees of the DEC, understand why we, the public, may feel that given its inability to do its job, the DEC should either be dismantled or renamed to more accurately describe its true function and replaced by another agency that is capable of responding appropriately to the environmental challenges of the times in which we live?
You are obviously going to get a lot of excellent comments between now and November 4th. My question, and some of it goes to the history of the S-Guys, where we're still waiting.
Excuse me, I didn't get any answer to my question. It's a real question. Is there any movement within the DEC to start to interpret or to create regulations that will actually protect the public? I think it's a simple question and it deserves an answer.
The regulations that we're discussing today have been designed to protect the public. We note your opinion, and we're moving forward.
Is there any movement within the DEC? Or are you all of one single mind that it's okay to be industry driven? Why can't you answer the question? Answer it as individuals. You in particular, sir, who are one of the decision makers, I want to hear it from your public relations mouth. We're fighting for our lives here. Do you understand?
Yeah.
And for your lives too.
There's a lot of things that we could try to respond to in your statement. And I know it will not seem wonderfully satisfactory to you. But as a state agency who operates underneath laws, we have certain things that we are tasked to do. The law tells us from the legislature what the policies are. The legislature passed this law. They came to us and said, this is the law, we've lifted the moratorium, we want you to go forward and draft regulations to do this. That is what we're doing. That is what we're working on. We are working on finding the industry standards and ways that we can do the job that the legislature in the law passed on to DEC and directed us to do. That being said, a lot of the policy issues that you're dealing with on whether it's appropriate and whether things should happen or not have to happen at the legislature who directs the DEC to do the work. I do not get to choose to look at the law and say I want to disregard it and I'm going to write something over here. You talk about having lawsuits come against DEC because we don't address the law. They happen from the other side too. If we go down the road and the legislature says do X, and we say no, we've looked at it, we want to do A. The regulation doesn't get passed. There's processes in place that will not let us pass a regulation that doesn't comply with the law. And if somehow it got through, the department then would be sued because we did not follow the law. So I understand your concern. I understand the statewide policy issues that you're talking about. But in terms of this regulation and this law, we don't have the ability to do what we say. We have to do what the law says.
So you are powerless, in other words. You are a powerless agency. Is that what you're saying? You are powerless.
That is your interpretation of what has been said
That's
here.
what's happening.
Fine. We accept your interpretation.
You're putting the public at risk by your powerlessness within the agency that is designed and paid for to protect us.
You're not doing your job for whatever reason.
Yeah, regarding the legislation, you're blaming the legislature here. Doesn't the governor have to sign the legislation?
Yes.
You know, that is how the process does work, ma'am, so you are correct. So, of course,
So
all
why,
of the elected...
why haven't we heard anything about the governor?
Well, he signed the legislation, correct? So he endorsed it at that time. Sir.
Okay, my name's Hugh Kimball. I live in Onondaga County. You are going to get a lot of very good comments that you need to consider seriously. My question goes to your procedure as to how this works after the hearing and after November 4th. And the basis for the question is related to what happened with the S guys. We're still waiting to get DEC's comments to the comments that we sent in 2011, much less the ones that we sent in 2012. So how does this work between the time of the end of this comment period and when your regulations come out? Are we going to get a response, obviously not individually, but in general to the comments that we send in before or after the regulations are issued, or what?
All of the comments will be consolidated, evaluated. Where appropriate changes in the regulation should occur, they will be made. And then the comments are all put into a responsiveness summary that does provide a response to, we tend to group thematically similar comments, but we provide a response to all comments, and that becomes a record that will be attached then to the declared regulation, should it reach that point. You noted the EIS process with regard to high volume hydrofracking. That process has not reached its conclusion yet. If and when it does, it will include a similar responsiveness document, much larger, I think, than the one that attached to this process, but that is how the process goes. Is that a fair representation?
Yep.
So the regs will be out after?
They come out at the same time. It all is, it's all part of a package. The rulemaking package includes the fact that we had these discussions, includes the fact that they'll have a narrative that describes this meeting and potentially some of the issues raised at the meeting, just narratively, not we don't have a transcript. That will be added, that will be part of the record. Also, any comments received during the comment period, at the hearing in 2 weeks, all become part of the record. Responses, as I say, are developed. Where changes that are suggested, called for, seem appropriate, they'll be included and described, and that's how it's done. Does that answer your questions?
Thank you.
Yes. Sir?
Yes. Just a question on the interstate. I'm wondering if we're looking at more of a tri-state issue, especially with the economy in mind. Is New York being left out, or are we trying to include ourselves in something? If you can pause and remember that, just here in Onondaga County, we are leaders in environmental safety. We recycle a lot. That's one of our top priorities, and we really pride ourselves on that. So just the second question, don't forget about the tri-state, the economy. Why not push these values here in Onondaga County to the state level and make them our values rather than something we can do for industry?
Thank you.
So, find the right comment. There it is. So, answering your question of are we in a tri-state type thing, going back to the beginning, I talked about some of the national perspective, and unfortunately there aren't any maps that I could get included in there, but as you look at LNG fueling stations in particular, the alternative fuel industry, there is kind of a whole called New York State in the Northeast. There are LNG fueling facilities in Ohio, one in Connecticut, and there is a hope that, is New York being left out? Well, some of the trucking industry would like to be able to go through New York State, but they can't get there without having some fuel. So that aspect is yes, and this regulation may address that.
So that would be more of a regional issue.
Right.
Okay. Anything about Onondaga County?
No, nothing specific at this point.
All right.
One more, and then we got to go back to the presentation.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, first of all, I had questions brought up. I know back in the process now. I do have to object to the idea that this is being handled in such a summary brevity of this process that we're seeing right now. It's happening very quickly. And considering now that we know that the production possibility for natural gas here in the state of New York is not as high as people have been saying. The viability of actual production, as well as going to be productive in the ground, is not very high, necessarily very high in the state. It could very well be that we have more LNG threats, more LNG potential for LNG facilities than gas wells. So I have to ask the question: why are we not taking a very comprehensive look at this? It involves a very high level of participation. Right. But I want to get back to something that was stated before, and that is the distinction between LNG and LPG, liquefied petroleum gas. And I understand that a statement was made that there was an exception to the rules for LPG. Sometimes you encounter situations in statute where you have an internal consistency, right? It says one thing in one place, it says the exact opposite somewhere else. You know, when I look at these environmental conservation law, I'm seeing very definitive statements about regulations that must be adopted for LNG and LPG, and you know, it even goes on to say effective passage thereof, and until regulations pursuant are adopted and filed, no liquefied natural or petroleum gas facilities may be constructed, reconstructed, enlarged, and storage capacity, or constructed but unused put into actual operation. So there's very definitive statements. There's an exception somewhere else. You potentially have an internal consistency. If that's the situation you put into, and I think it may be, then I would say to you that now is not the time to be interpreting what you might think you might have to be being told what to do, but instead finding out from the legislature what your really supposed to do.
So it would be easier to sit down with the law with you on this, but what it does is, although the law talks about LPG, it then goes on to exempt materials that are stored in low temperature.
In the part where it talks about LPG, it says definitive statements about what must happen. It doesn't say except as otherwise provided or exempted or in it. You know, it doesn't have that type of language. So I think an argument can be made that you've got internal inconsistency here with the legislature as a result.
Well, I think that's, we would agree with you on that one.
You agree with me that
we agree with you that
the
law appears to have some internal contradictions to itself.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you for agreeing with it.
Great. We'd like to continue now and come back to questions after the next segment of the thing, of the presentation. Sorry.